In the quiet hum of the city hospital's ICU, where the air smelled of antiseptic and whispered prayers, Sarah moved like a shadow through the dim corridors, her pale green scrubs clinging to her frame after a 12-hour shift. It was past midnight. The world outside softened into silence, but inside these walls time stretched slow and heavy, each moment weighted with hope or surrender. Room 312 was her sanctuary, a small space where the fluorescent lights flickered faintly, casting a sterile glow over the white sheets and blinking monitors. Sarah paused at the door, her hand resting on the cool metal handle, her breath catching, as it always did before stepping into the presence of Michael, the patient who had become her unspoken confidant. He lay still, his chest rising and falling, with the mechanical rhythm of the ventilator, his face calm yet distant, like a man lost in a dream he couldn't share. At 35, his dark hair was flecked with early silver, his strong jaw softened by months of stillness, but there was something in his features, a quiet strength that hinted at a life once lived loudly. Sarah carried a worn ukulele, its wood, chipped from years of use, and a small leather notebook tucked under her arm, its pages filled with half-written lyrics and hospital schedules. Her eyes, heavy with exhaustion, held a flicker of something else, a longing that hadn't yet been extinguished by grief or circumstance. 2 years ago, her father had slipped away, his body ravaged by leukemia, leaving behind a void that echoed in her small apartment above a noisy diner. She'd been a music therapy student, then her days filled with chords and dreams of healing through song, but his illness had rewritten her future trading textbooks for medical bills and stage lights for night shifts. The hospital was her refuge. Now its quiet nights a canvas for the music. She could no longer sing in daylight. She closed the door behind her, the latch clicking softly like the final note of a lullaby only she could hear. Setting the ukulele on the bedside table, she sat in the worn chair beside Michael, her hands trembling slightly as she adjusted the blanket over his still form. No one came for him, no family, no friends, just a name on a chart and a story pieced together from fragments: a motorcycle accident, a rainy night, a life interrupted. Sarah didn't know why she was drawn to him. Perhaps it was the way his brow furrowed slightly, as if he were thinking even in silence, or the calluses on his fingers that spoke of a craft she could only guess at. She reached for her notebook, flipping to a page where she'd scribbled a line from a song her father loved: "You are my sunshine, my only sunshine." Her voice, when she spoke, was barely a whisper. "Michael, I don't know if you're in there, but you're my safe place tonight. I hope you don't mind if I sing a little. It's the only way I can keep from falling apart." She brushed a stray lock of hair from his forehead, her touch gentle, almost reverent, then picked up the ukulele, her fingers finding the familiar chords. The strings hummed softly, filling the room with a warmth that pushed back the cold sterility. She sang not for an audience, but for herself, for the girl she used to be, for the man who might never wake. Her voice was soft at first, hesitant like a bird testing its wings, but it grew steadier with each note, carrying the weight of her father's laughter and the ache of her own loneliness. The monitors beeped in rhythm, a quiet metronome to her melody, and for a moment the room felt less like a hospital and more like a chapel where broken things could still be sacred. Sarah didn't know that Michael, a former violinist whose hands had once danced across strings in smoky jazz clubs, could hear her. His world was a fog of darkness, but her voice cut through like a lantern in a storm, stirring memories of stages and spotlights, of a fiancé whose laughter had been his favorite song. He couldn't move, couldn't open his eyes, but he clung to her notes, each one a thread pulling him closer to the surface. Sarah finished her song, her fingers lingering on the ukulele as the final chord faded. She looked at Michael, hoping for a sign, a twitch, a flicker, but his face remained still. She smiled anyway, a small tired smile, and whispered, "You're not alone, Michael, I'll be back tomorrow." She placed a sprig of mint from her apartment's tiny garden on the table beside him, its faint scent a rebellion against the hospital's sharpness. As she stood, her knees ached from the long shift, her heart heavy with the knowledge that her job was on shaky ground. Budget cuts loomed like storm clouds, and her contract hung by a thread. Yet in this moment, none of that mattered. Singing to Michael was her anchor, a way to hold on to the music she'd lost, to keep her father's memory alive, to believe that even in silence, someone might be listening. She gathered her things, the ukulele tucked under her arm, and stepped toward the door, pausing to glance back at him. "Sleep well, Michael," she said, her voice barely audible. "Thank you for being here, even if you don't know it." The door closed behind her, its soft click echoing in the quiet room. The monitor beeped steadily, but Michael's heart rate ticked just a fraction faster, a secret kept by the machines. Sarah walked down the corridor, her sneakers squeaking faintly on the polished floor, unaware that her song had reached a soul she thought was lost. Outside, the city slept, but in room 312 a spark had been lit, faint but undeniable, a promise that this was only the beginning. Sarah slipped into room 312 each night, like a ritual, her sneakers whispering against the polished hospital floor, her heart finding solace in the soft beep of Michael's monitors that marked the passage of time in a world suspended between hope and surrender. The ICU was quieter now, the midnight hours cloaking the ward, in a stillness that felt almost holy, and Sarah carried her chipped ukulele and leather notebook, her only companions, besides the man who lay silent in the bed. She was 82 nights into this unspoken pact, her voice a lifeline not just for Michael, but for herself, a tether to the music she'd buried when her father's illness stole her dreams of music therapy. Her pale green scrubs hung loosely on her frame, exhaustion etched into the shadows under her eyes, yet she sat beside Michael, her fingers brushing the mint sprig she'd left the night before, its scent still lingering like a quiet defiance against the sterile air. Michael's face, unchanged, held a mystery that drew her in the faint lines around his eyes, suggesting a life of laughter and loss. His calloused fingers hinting at a craft she imagined might mirror her own love for strings. She opened her notebook, its pages a patchwork of lyrics and worries. A scribbled note about a rude visitor in room 305, next to a half-finished verse about moonlight. "Michael, I had a rough day," she whispered, her voice soft as if afraid to disturb. "The sanctity of the room, they're talking about budget cuts again, and I don't know how much longer I can stay." She traced the edge of his blanket, her touch gentle, then picked up the ukulele, its familiar weight grounding her. Tonight she chose Hallelujah by Leonard Cohen. The chords slow and mournful, her voice trembling at first, but growing stronger as the melody filled the room like a prayer. The words carried her grief for her father, her fear of losing this job, her longing for a life where music wasn't confined to these stolen moments. Unbeknownst to her, Michael heard every note, his consciousness trapped in a body that refused to move, her voice piercing the fog of his coma, like a melody he'd once played on his violin in jazz clubs, where smoke curled around laughter. He'd been a musician, vibrant and alive, until a fire claimed his fiancée Clara. Her absence leaving his world silent, his violin untouched, his heart adrift, until that rainy night when the accident landed him here. Sarah's singing stirred memories of Clara's smile, of stages lit by candlelight, and though he couldn't open his eyes, he clung to her voice, each note a reason to fight the darkness. Sarah sang on, unaware, her voice weaving a bridge between her loneliness and his silent struggle, the monitors beeping in time with her chords as if joining her song. She began leaving small tokens, a daisy from the hospital garden, a note that read, "Good morning, Michael. Your vitals were strong today," tucked beside his pillow. She'd spritz a hint of her chamomile perfume into the air, whispering so you don't feel so much like you're in a hospital. Her care a quiet rebellion against the detachment nursing demanded. Some nights she talked to him, her words spilling, like lyrics about the diner below her apartment, where the smell of burnt coffee woke her each morning, or the old woman in room 319 who called her Sunshine. "Michael, you'd like her," she said once, smiling. "I bet you'd have stories to tell too if you could." Her voice broke sometimes, especially on nights when the weight of her father's absence pressed too hard, and she'd pause mid-song, her fingers still on the strings, tears falling silently onto the ukulele. Yet she kept singing, because in this room with Michael as her only audience, she could be the girl who once dreamed of healing through music. The other nurses noticed her ritual, teasing her gently about her sleeping prince, but Sarah just smiled, her heart too full to explain that singing to Michael was her way of surviving, of holding on to the belief that broken things could still hold beauty. One night after a particularly grueling shift, She sang a lullaby her father used to hum, her voice cracking on the final note, and she thought she saw Michael's fingers twitch. She froze her eyes, darting to the monitor, but it showed no change, and she shook her head, blaming the flickering lights. Still, from that night on, she sang as if he were listening, as if her voice could reach the part of him that hadn't given up. Michael felt her presence like warmth through a window, her chamomile scent, her soft laughter, her stories about the world beyond his darkness, becoming his only map back to life. He memorized the way her voice curled around vowels, the way she said his name with a tenderness that made him want to wake. When she cried, he felt a pang in his chest, a longing to reach out to tell her he was there, but his body held him captive. Sarah's music was more than sound. It was a lifeline, a reminder of the man he'd been, the one who'd played for love, not applause. She finished Hallelujah that night, her voice lingering on the final chord, her eyes tracing Michael's face, for a sign that never came. She set the ukulele down, her fingers brushing his hand, cold but familiar, and whispered, "You're keeping me sane, Michael. Thank you for that." She tucked a new note beside him. "Sleep well. I'll bring a new song tomorrow," and stood, her knees aching, her heart heavy, with the fear that her days here were numbered. The hospital's budget cuts loomed closer, her supervisor's words about staff reductions echoing in her mind. But in room 312, those worries faded. Singing to Michael was her defiance, her proof that music could still matter even in silence. She glanced back as she reached the door, her silhouette framed by the dim light, Michael's still form a quiet promise that she'd return. The door clicked shut, the monitors beep steady, but Michael's heart pulsed just a little stronger, her song echoing in the space where his soul fought to surface. Sarah stood outside room 312, her heart pounding like a drum against her ribs, the hospital corridor stretching endlessly under the fluorescent hum as the weight of the day's news pressed into her chest like a stone too heavy to carry. It was her final shift. The hospital administrator's words still ringing, budget cuts, departmental restructuring. "We're so sorry, Sarah. Your contract won't be renewed." She'd nodded in that small, windowless office, her hands clutching a folder. To have exit paperwork, her smile forced while her mind screamed that this place, these nights, this quiet room with Michael, had been her anchor since her father's death. Now it was slipping away like the last notes of a song she'd never finish. She pushed open the door, the familiar beep of Michael's monitors, greeting her like an old friend, the dim light casting soft shadows over his still form. His face, unchanged, held that quiet strength she'd come to know, the faint furrow in his brow as if he were dreaming of a world she couldn't reach. Sarah set her ukulele on the bedside table, next to the wilting daisy she'd left days ago, her leather notebook trembling in her hands as she sat beside him. "Michael, I don't know if you're in there," she whispered, her voice cracking, "but you've been my safe place, and tonight I have to say goodbye." The words broke something inside her, tears welling as she thought of her father's laughter, the music therapy dreams she'd abandoned, the diner apartment, where silence waited like a thief. She reached for his hand, cold but familiar, her fingers tracing the calluses that spoke of a life she'd never know. "No one came for you, Michael," she said softly, "just like no one's coming for me now. But you listened, even if you didn't mean to." She pulled a folded note from her pocket. "Thank you for hearing me even in silence," and slipped it under his pillow, her touch lingering as if to memorize the moment. The hospital's budget cuts had stripped her of more than a job they'd taken, the one place where she could sing, where she could be the girl who believed music could heal. She picked up the ukulele, her fingers finding the chords to "The Night We Met" by Lord Huron, the melody slow and haunting, its lyrics a mirror to her unraveling heart. She sang, her voice trembling, but clear, "I had all, and then most of you some, and now none of you." The words spilling like a confession, each note carrying her fear, her grief, her gratitude for the man who'd become her silent audience. Unbeknownst to her, Michael heard every syllable, his consciousness trapped in a body that refused to obey her voice, a beacon in the fog of his coma, where memories of his fiancée Clara's laughter and his violin's strings flickered like dying embers. Sarah's song was a lifeline, pulling him closer to the surface, his heart stirring with a longing to reach her, to tell her he was there. As she sang, the monitor registered a slight spike in his heart rate, a subtle twitch in his fingers. But Sarah, lost in her own sorrow, didn't see. Her voice faltered on the final verse, tears streaming down her cheeks, falling silently onto the ukulele as she leaned closer. "Michael, I don't know if you ever heard me, but you kept me going, and I'm so sorry. I can't stay." The song ended. The room heavy with its echo, her chamomile perfume mingling with the antiseptic air, as she rested her head beside him, still holding his hand, still singing in whispers. Then it happened. A single tear slid down Michael's cheek, a quiet testament to the music that had reached him. But Sarah, her eyes blurred with her own tears, didn't notice. She sat up, wiping her face with the back of her hand, her breath shaky. As she gathered her things, the ukulele tucked under her arm, the notebook clutched to her chest. "Sleep well, Michael," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Thank you for being my reason to sing." She leaned in, hesitating, then pressed a soft kiss to his forehead, her lips trembling, a gesture she'd never dared before, the first and last time she'd crossed that line. The warmth of her touch lingered on his skin, a spark in the darkness of his silent world. But Sarah was already turning away, her sneakers squeaking faintly as she reached the door. She paused, her hand on the handle, her heart screaming to stay. But the reality of her empty apartment, her uncertain future, pushed her forward. "I hope you felt a little less alone," she said, glancing back one last time, her eyes tracing his still form. The daisy, the note, the room that had held her music for 82 nights. The door clicked shut, the sound final, like the end of a melody she'd never play again. Inside, the monitor beeped a fraction faster. Michael's fingers twitched once more, his eyelids fluttering almost imperceptibly as the echo of her song cracked something open in his soul. He couldn't move, couldn't speak, but her voice, her kiss, her chamomile scent had stirred a fire he thought had died with Clara. Sarah stepped into the corridor, her empty coffee thermos clutched in her hand, her eyes burning, but refusing to cry, not yet. She walked past room 319, where the old woman called her sunshine, past the nurse's station, where her colleagues' laughter felt distant, past the life she'd built in these quiet nights. In room 312, the silence had shifted, a connection forged, in music and kindness, lingering like a promise neither could yet understand. Sarah didn't know that her songs had reached a man who'd given up on life, didn't know that her final note had been the one to pull him closer to waking. She rode the elevator down, her heart heavy, but her soul lighter, as if singing to Michael one last time had released something she'd held too tightly. Outside, the city was asleep, the stars hidden by clouds, but in her mind she saw Michael's face, calm, steady, listening. She stepped into the night, unaware that the man she'd sung to was fighting to follow her voice back to the world. Michael's eyes fluttered open to the soft glow of morning light, creeping through the blinds of room 312, the hospital air sharp with antiseptic, and the faint trace of chamomile that lingered like a ghost of Sarah's presence. His body heavy, as if waking from a dream that had lasted a lifetime. The monitors beeped steadily, their rhythm a stark contrast to the chaos in his mind where her voice echoed. The night we met, its haunting melody, pulling him from the darkness, like a hand reaching into deep water. He was 35, his dark hair streaked with silver, his limbs stiff from months of stillness, but the first thing he felt was her kiss on his forehead, a warmth that had cracked the silence of his coma. Nurses rushed in, their voices, a blur of questions. "Can you hear us? What's your name? Can you move your fingers?" But Michael's gaze drifted to the bedside table, where a wilted daisy and a sprig of mint sat like relics of a world he'd only heard through her songs. His throat dry, he rasped, "Where's the nurse who sang, the one who was here every night?" His words halting but urgent. The nurse with warm eyes paused, her smile tinged with sadness. "You mean Sarah? She was let go a week ago. Budget cuts broke her heart to leave. She cared about you." Michael's chest tightened, her name a key, unlocking memories of her soft chords, her whispered stories, her tears falling as she sang Hallelujah. He'd been a violinist once, playing in jazz clubs where Clara, his fiancée, laughed under dim lights. But her death in a fire had silenced his music, his life, until Sarah's voice found him in this bed. He couldn't let her slip away like a song he'd never hear again. The doctors protested when he asked for discharge paperwork too soon. They said, "Your recovery's just begun." But Michael's resolve was iron. He had no family, no ties, only her voice tethering him to the world. They found the note under his pillow. "Thank you for hearing me even in silence," her handwriting small but steady, and he clutched it like a map to a treasure he'd lost. Days later, he left the hospital in borrowed clothes, a cane steadying his steps, the city sprawling before him, like a melody he had to learn again. He started with her name, Sarah Ellis, piecing together fragments from her stories, the diner she lived, above the cafe where she'd once sung open mic nights. A helpful receptionist at the hospital gave him a lead. Sarah had listed a local music shop as a reference on her employee file. He found the shop, its windows lined with guitars and sheet music, the air thick with the scent of polished wood. The owner, an older man with a grey beard, remembered her. She used to come in for ukulele strings, always humming something sad but beautiful. Moved out a week ago. No forwarding address. Michael's heart sank, but he pressed on her chamomile scent, her soft laughter driving him like a rhythm he couldn't shake. He scoured social media, finding a defunct profile under Sarah Sings. A single video of her performing at a cafe, her ukulele strumming a cover of Over the Rainbow, her voice raw and human. The comments were old, but one mentioned a community music event where she'd performed years ago. He tracked down the event's organizer, a woman named Lila, who ran a weekly open mic at a library across town. Lila's eyes lit up when he mentioned Sarah. She was here a few times. Voice like an angel, haven't seen her since she started working nights at the hospital. Michael showed her the note, Sarah's words trembling in his hand. "I need to find her. She saved me without knowing it." Lila promised to ask around, but warned him Sarah kept to herself, like she was carrying something heavy. Michael spent days walking the city, his cane clicking against sidewalks, his body weak, but his purpose clear. He visited the diner Sarah had mentioned, its neon sign flickering above a street that smelled of grease and coffee, climbing the stairs to her old apartment, where a neighbor said she'd moved out, no one knew where. He stood there, staring at the peeling doorframe, imagining her coming home, exhausted, her ukulele slung over her shoulder. From his pocket, he pulled a small vial of chamomile oil he'd bought at a market. It sent a mirror to hers, and left it on the doorstep with a note, "Thank you, Sarah, for singing to a soul that was lost." He didn't sign it, just folded the paper, and walked away, his heart heavy but hopeful. Back at his temporary room, a rented space above a bookstore, he listened to her cafe video on repeat, her voice wrapping around him like a blanket, stirring memories of Clara, but also something new. Belief that music could heal again. He'd sold his violin after her death, the pain too sharp, but Sarah's songs had rekindled a spark, a need to play, to live, to find her. He contacted a local music school, asking about Sarah, mentioning her ukulele, her performances, and a teacher. Recalled her applying for a scholarship years ago before dropping out. The trail was cold, but Michael clung to every clue, her stories about the moon, her love for her father's lullabies, her fear of losing her place in the world. He didn't know if she'd want to see him a stranger. She'd sung to in silence, but he owed her his life, his music, his return from the darkness. Each night he lay awake, her voice in his mind, her kiss on his forehead, a promise he couldn't break. He visited hospitals, clinics, anywhere she might have applied for work, but her name was gone like a song cut short. Yet he felt her presence, in the city's rhythm, the way strangers hummed on buses, the way stars peeked through clouds, as if she'd left pieces of her music everywhere. Michael's search was more than gratitude. It was a rediscovery of himself, a man who'd forgotten how to hope, until a nurse sang him back to life. He stood on a bridge one evening, the city lights reflecting on the water, and whispered, "Sarah, I'm looking for you, please be out there." The wind carried his words away, but in his heart, her melody played on, unbroken, undeniable, a vow to find the woman whose voice had become his reason to wake. The old library hall buzzed with quiet anticipation, its wooden beams and stained glass windows glowing under the warm light of hanging lanterns as a small crowd gathered for the weekly community music night, their murmurs blending with the soft clink of coffee cups and the rustle of programs. Sarah stood backstage, her hands trembling around her ukulele, its chipped wood, a familiar weight against her racing heart, her first performance since leaving the hospital, a step toward reclaiming the music she'd buried under grief and night shifts. She wore a simple grey dress, her father's silver watch glinting on her wrist, a reminder of the man who'd taught her to sing with courage. 2 weeks had passed since her final night in room 312, her goodbye to Michael, a wound that hadn't healed the note she'd left under his pillow. Thank you for hearing me even in silence, a confession she thought he'd never read. The library's open mic was a small stage, but it felt vast. Her nerves humming like the strings, she tuned her eyes scanning the crowd for a familiar face, though she knew no one would come. She'd moved to a new apartment, a modest studio near a park where buskers played on weekends, the rent mysteriously paid for 6 months by an anonymous donor. A miracle she didn't question, but felt like a gift from her father's memory. The MC called her name Sarah Ellis, and she stepped into the spotlight, the ukulele slung across her chest, her breath catching as the room fell silent. She chose Over the Rainbow, its chords soft and wistful, her voice entering like a whisper. Hesitant at first, but growing stronger with each note, as if the song were pulling her back to the girl who dreamed of healing through music. The audience leaned in their faces, soft with attention, and Sarah closed her eyes, picturing room 312. Michael still formed the daisy on his table, the chamomile scent she'd left to mask the hospital's coldness. Her voice broke slightly on Somewhere Over the Rainbow, her tears held back, but her heart opened the song, a bridge to the night she'd sung for a man she thought couldn't hear. Unbeknownst to her, Michael sat in the back row, his cane resting against his knee, his dark eyes fixed on her, his heart pounding as her voice filled the hall, the same voice that had pulled him from the coma's darkness. He'd found her through Lila, the music event organizer, who'd remembered Sarah's name from his desperate inquiries. Her note clutched in his hand, its words now framed in simple wood tucked inside his coat. He'd spent days searching the city's cafes, libraries, music shops, each dead end a test of his resolve, until 7 days ago. His body weak from months in a coma, but his spirit unbroken, driven by the need to find the nurse who'd saved him. Tonight he'd almost given up hope, but a flyer for the library's open mic caught his eye, and there she was, listed as a performer. He'd arrived early, his breath shallow as he waited, the memory of her kiss on his forehead, her final song, the night we met, a lifeline he'd clung to in the fog of his silence. As Sarah sang, Michael felt the weight of those 82 nights, her voice a melody of kindness, her stories of the diner, the moon, her father's lullabies stitching his soul back together. His fiancée Clara's death had silenced his violin, but Sarah's music had rekindled his will to live, to play, to hope. When she finished the final note of Over the Rainbow, the room held its breath, no coughs, no rustling, just a sacred stillness. Sarah bowed quickly. Her cheeks flushed, her eyes bright with unshed tears, and stepped toward the wings, her heart lighter, as if the song had released a piece of her grief. But before she could disappear, the MC took the microphone, his voice warm. We have a special guest who'd like to say a few words, someone close to tonight's performer. Sarah froze, confused, her gaze darting to the stage's edge, where a man emerged, walking slowly. His limp slight but steady, his presence undeniable. Michael's hair was shorter now, his face thinner, but his eyes, those quiet, steady eyes, locked onto hers across the stage. She gasped, her hand rising to her mouth, as recognition hit Michael, the man she'd sung to for 82 nights, the man she'd kissed goodbye, believing he'd never wake. He held a small wooden frame, his fingers trembling, but his posture resolute as he reached the microphone, nodding a quiet thanks to the MC. I'm not here for a long speech, he said, his voice low but clear, like a violin's first note. After years of silence, there's someone on this stage who sang to me every night, thinking I couldn't hear her, but I heard every word, every note. The crowd murmured softly, their curiosity a gentle hum, but Sarah stood rooted, her breath catching, as memories flooded back the ukulele's chords, her whispered confessions, the daisy by his bed. Michael held up the frame, turning it toward her. I found this under my pillow, her handwriting clear. Thank you for hearing me, even in silence. Her knees buckled slightly, her eyes blurring with tears. As he continued, she didn't know her voice was the only thread keeping me tethered to this world. She didn't know she was saving a life. The audience leaned forward, some dabbing their eyes, but Michael's gaze never left Sarah's. If you ever sing for the world, Sarah, he said, his voice steady, please let one song be for me. The hall fell silent a moment, so pure it needed no applause. Then Sarah moved her feet, carrying her across the stage, her breath ragged, her grey dress swaying as she closed the distance. She reached him, her arms wrapping around his shoulders, her face pressing into his neck as tears fell fast and unfiltered. Michael held her tightly, his cane forgotten, his arms strong despite his frailty, his breath warm against her hair. "I came back for you," he whispered. Sarah pulled back just enough to meet his eyes, her smile breaking through tears. "I knew you heard me," she said, her voice a whisper. "I sang, because I believed you did." The audience rose as one, their silence a tribute to a moment too sacred for noise. Then slowly a single clap began spreading, until the hall thundered with applause, not just for the music, but for the miracle of connection. Sarah and Michael stood together, their foreheads touching, her ukulele still slung across her chest, his framed note cradled between them, a testament to 82 nights of kindness that had stitched a soul back to life. 1 year later, the sun spilled through the open windows of a sunlit apartment above a quaint bookstore. Its walls lined with Sarah's ukulele and Michael's violin, the air carrying the scent of chamomile tea and the distant hum of a park where children laughed and buskers strummed on lazy afternoons. Sarah, now 29, moved through the space with a quiet grace, her pale green scrubs replaced by a flowered blouse, her eyes brighter than they'd been in the dim ICU nights of room 312. She was a music therapy student again, her tuition covered. By a mysterious scholarship, Michael had quietly arranged using the wealth he'd inherited, but never flaunted a secret he'd kept until she found the paperwork tucked in a drawer, her tears of gratitude met with his shy smile. Michael, 36, now walked without a cane. His limp faded, though his body still bore the scars of the accident that had silenced him, until Sarah's voice pulled him back. Their life together was simple, but rich, measured in morning coffee shared, over song lyrics, and evenings where they played together, her ukulele blending with his violin in melodies that felt like promises. Michael had converted their spare room into a small music studio, its walls adorned with photos of Sarah's hospital notes and daisies pressed from those 82 nights, offering free violin lessons to children on the autism spectrum whose eyes lit up at the strings in ways words never could. Sarah, meanwhile, had rediscovered her voice, not just the one that sang, but the one that dreamed without fear. Her first EP, For the Listener, recorded in a local studio, its title a tribute to Michael, her father, and anyone who'd ever sung into silence, hoping for an answer. The night of her album's launch, the community theater brimmed with faces, nurses who'd teased her about her sleeping Prince students from her music classes, strangers who'd heard her story through whispers in the city's music scene. Sarah stood backstage, her heart pounding, but steady, her father's silver watch glinting under the stage lights, her grey dress swaying as she clutched her ukulele. Michael waited behind the grand piano, his fingers poised, his dark hair falling slightly over eyes that held hers with a quiet intensity. The lights dimmed. The crowd hushed and Sarah stepped forward, her voice opening with Hallelujah, its chords slower, softer than Leonard Cohen's, intimate as a prayer shared in room 312. Michael's piano swelled behind her, lifting her melody, their harmony, a tapestry of the lonely nights, the whispered goodbyes, the miracle of his awakening. Her voice wavered on the final verse, tears brimming as she sang for the hospital's antiseptic halls, for her father's lullabies, for the man who'd heard her when she thought no one could. The last note hung in the air, fragile, sacred, and the audience erupted their applause, a wave of love that shook the theater's old walls. Sarah turned to Michael, her smile radiant through tears, expecting him to stand and bow, but instead he reached behind the piano, pulling a small velvet pouch from his jacket. The crowd quieted, sensing something deeper, as he walked to center stage, his steps deliberate, his eyes never leaving hers. He took the microphone, his voice steady but thick with emotion. "I once lay in a hospital bed, completely still, believing I was already gone, the world dark and silent until someone sang." Sarah's breath caught her hand rising to her mouth as he continued. "She didn't know I could hear her, didn't know her voice was the only thing keeping me alive, but it reached me. It became the only reason I wanted to wake." The theater was silent, every heart held in the gravity of his words. Michael took a breath tonight. "I want to do more than thank you. I want to sing beside you for the rest of my life. I want to grow old, hearing your stories, your laughter, your songs." He knelt, the velvet pouch opening to reveal a simple silver ring, its surface etched with a tiny daisy. "Sarah, will you marry me?" he asked, his voice soft but clear, hope and humility in every word. Sarah's hands flew to her face, tears spilling as the theater blurred, until there was only Michael on one knee, his eyes shining with the same steadiness she'd seen in room 312. Yes, she whispered, then louder. Yes, her voice breaking with joy. The crowd surged to their feet, applause thundering like a summer storm as Michael slipped the ring onto her finger, its daisy catching the light a nod to the flowers she'd left by his bedside. He stood pulling her into an embrace, their foreheads touching as they laughed and cried in the same breath, her ukulele pressed between them, his arms steady around her. The audience's cheers faded into a warm hum, their love a quiet center in the storm of sound. This wasn't a fairy tale, it was truer, stitched together by 82 nights of kindness, by music that healed what grief had broken, by a belief that even silent hearts could find harmony. Sarah pulled back her eyes, locked on his. I sang for you because I felt you listening. She said, her voice a vow, and I'll keep singing for you always. Michael smiled, his hand brushing her cheek, then turned to the piano, his fingers finding the opening notes of Over the Rainbow, a song she'd sung alone, now theirs. Sarah joined her ukulele, blending with his melody, their voices rising together, not for applause but for each other, for the nights they'd survived, for the mornings they'd built. The theater glowed its walls, holding the echo of their story, a testament to the power of a nurse's selfless song, a violinist's silent fight, a love born in the quiet spaces where hope still sang. As the final chord faded, Sarah and Michael stood hand in hand, her ring glinting, his framed note tucked in his pocket, their life ahead, a canvas for new songs. They bowed together, the crowd's applause, a celebration not just of music, but of miracles, small, stubborn, and true. Outside the park's buskers played on the stars bright above the city, and in that moment Sarah and Michael knew their story wasn't an ending, but a second verse, one they'd write together, note by note, heart by heart.